Hey everyone, welcome to Movie Marathons HQ, where we do movie marathons connected to new releases and where we enjoy and review some of our favorite movies. This video is part of the Spider-Man Brand New Day Movie Marathon and the Avengers Doomsday Movie Marathon, where we are watching one movie every week as we prepare for the release of Spider-Man Brand New Day in July 2026 and Avengers Doomsday in December 2026. Today we are discussing The Amazing Spider-Man 2, released in 2014 and directed again by Mark Webb. This is the follow-up to the reboot that we saw in The Amazing Spider-Man, and we see an expanded universe of Spider-Man characters here brought in from the comics. Overall, there are some positives in this movie, as there were in The Amazing Spider-Man, and we've moved away from the origin. This just feels like we've gone through the origin, now we're ready for a Spider-Man adventure. So there's a lot going for this movie, but the villains really drag it down, and we'll get into that as we get into the negatives. There certainly still are some positives and some things that I really like here, but overall it's negative, and this was again kind of a disaster, not so much financially, but just in the sense that the audience didn't really connect with this movie as much, and then a choice was made to do another reboot of the Spider-Man character. For positives, I think the visual effects are really great, especially the design of Electro. There's an opening scene here, which is one of my favorite opening scenes of all movies of all time. I go back and watch just the opening scene pretty frequently. There's some action scenes that incorporate a lot of slow-mo that's really cool and really effective. The score by Hans Zimmer, my favorite composer, I think is actually really sick and very, very cool. And then the chemistry between Peter and Gwen carries on from the first movie being a very strong point. And then for negatives, I think the characterization of Electro is not very good. There's a scene where a musical choice takes me out of the movie completely and really doesn't fit. Some of the editing is really crazy and hard to follow and really fast. And then the biggest negative is the entire Harry Osborn subplot from beginning, middle to end, except for the casting of Dane DeHaan, who I think is really good. In other things, he's not any good here, but that's the only thing that's good about that. But otherwise, everything to do with Harry Osborn is a negative. Spoiler alert for The Amazing Spider-Man 2. So the visual effects are positive. We get more first-person web swinging and flying through the city, which is really cool, but especially the design of Electro. In the comics in the 60s and the old school type of design of Electro, he had a very silly yellow and green outfit. Here they chose to design Electro from the Ultimates Marvel Comics universe, where he is more of a blue electricity thing. And I think the visual effects look stunning here. You can see a light coming from within and through the skin, especially in his cheeks and in his face. You can see light coming through, and there's some translucence to his skin. And then as he's using electricity and floating and hovering, and everything about Electro looks really, really cool. So I think the visual effects are really positive. And then as they get into some of the fight scenes and towards the end, the big battle, there's lots of visual effects and lots of lightning and web electrifying and stuff, but I think it's really well done. So the visual effects are very positive here. Next, the opening scene is phenomenal. As I said before, I go back and watch this opening scene every now and again. It's just Spider-Man swinging and throughout the city, and he's running up things and jumping off things and diving and first person swinging through stuff. And then they play on a really, really good joke from the comics. In the comics, Spider-Man will come swinging into frame, and he's not really connected to anything. So the joke is Spider-Man in a city can be shooting his webs and attaching to buildings, but when he's out in another location outside of buildings, what is he connected to? And the joke that Marvel artists would say is just outside of the frame, there's a helicopter. And so Spider-Man is shooting his web, attaching to the helicopter that the viewer can't see in the comic book panel, and that's how he's swinging around. So the joke is there's always a helicopter out of frame, and that's how Spider-Man swings around. And so in that opening scene, he does connect to a helicopter and swings through, which I think is just a little goofy nod. Maybe it's accidental, but I pick up on that and I really like it. But it's really phenomenal of an opening scene for this movie. Next, there are some action scenes that use slow motion in a really effective way. I think maybe it was the decision of Mark Webb to slow things down because we have Spider-Man fighting Electro, played by Jamie Foxx. And so the electricity goes at the speed of light or the speed of sound, correct me however that is, but it's very fast. And so then slowing it down just shows how Peter is barely dodging these lightning bolts and barely getting away from things unscathed. But I think there's lots of moments, and even in that opening scene, there's some really cool slow-mo where the camera slows down on him, really lets you breathe and feel the moment before kicking back into regular speed. So I think that strategy is used very effectively throughout this whole movie. There's also the scene where Max Dillon as Electro is discovering his powers in Times Square and everything slows down and you see some realization come across his face. And then he's shooting lightning around and then Peter is realizing that his webs conduct electricity, but he still is trying to save the people so they don't get shocked. And there's some really effective slow motion in that scene specifically. James Horner, who wrote the score in The Amazing Spider-Man, did not return for The Amazing Spider-Man 2, and instead we get a score composed by Hans Zimmer. He is my favorite composer of all time, so I'm a little bit biased towards this, but I think his score in this movie is very cool. He almost adds some dubstep type sounds into the score, which works for Electro being an electricity-based villain, and I think it's a very powerful score. There's a scene towards the end where Electro is bouncing between power grid things, transistors or something, I don't know what they call them, and the tones as he hits each power tower plays out the song The Itsy Bitsy Spider, and I think that is pretty cheesy. But then throughout the rest of that fight, they do keep playing that musical motif, and it does kind of work. So it goes from pretty cheesy to then working into the score, and I just think it's a really great score. It's probably not in Hans Zimmer's top 10, but it would be in his top 20. Finally, we have the relationship and the chemistry between Peter Parker and Gwen Stacy. Here we have the return of Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone as these characters, and their chemistry continues to be so strong. They did have a relationship off screen at this time, which probably plays into it, but that doesn't always work on screen, as we've seen historically. But these two characters really care about each other, and in the plot of the story in the movie, they're in conflict where Gwen gets accepted to Oxford and she's leaving the country. And how does Spider-Man leave New York City? He can't, but he loves her and wants to be with her, but also he made a promise to her father that he'd stay away from her to keep her safe from his superhero antics and villains and danger. And they just have a really interesting play where they are not toxic. And as I said before in the Spider-Man trilogy, I think that Tobey Maguire's Peter Parker and Kirsten Dunst, Mary Jane Watson, are toxic and a terrible match for one another. It's really refreshing to see these two that, yes, they have their issues and they both have their personality quirks, but you do still root for them to be together, and I think that's really strong. And I really appreciate the relationship continues to evolve, especially as we get to the end where Gwen Stacy meets her end at the hands of the Green Goblin, which is a very famous storyline from the comics, and they do a really great job visually representing. If you're a Spider-Man comics reader like I am, you saw that coming from a mile away. But even the clothing that she's wearing and the setup of the clock tower, we knew where that was headed, and I think that was a very bold choice to adapt that part of the comics into this movie. But I think it was well executed, especially because we had such a strong foundation of their relationship and their chemistry and their love for one another, that then it gets ripped apart by the villain at the end. So even though I don't like the ending part of that, which we'll get into, I do really like Andrew Garfield and Emma Stone here. And then for negatives, I don't like the characterization of Electro. So I like introducing Electro as the villain. We hadn't seen him in a live-action Spider-Man movie, so he's a unique villain from the comics that's worth adapting. And Jamie Foxx is a pretty good actor, but the character Max Dillon is written as so nerdy that he's not relatable. They want him to be that way. They want us to see him as an outcast and a loner, and then he feels like Spider-Man gives him attention, so he thinks he's friends, but he doesn't seem like a real character. He seems very like a caricature of a person and not a real person himself. And then this is very nitpicky, but when he falls into the vat of electric eels, again, as I said in the Amazing Spider-Man review, I like that Oscorp is connected to all of this. So Max falls into a pit of electric eels and he gets his powers, and somehow being electrified fixes the gap in his teeth. I don't understand that at all. So I think the character is cool, but the characterization doesn't work. There's also a scene where the evil scientists at Oscorp are experimenting on Electro after they've caught him, and a very famous classical music song kicks in called the Blue Danube Waltz by Johann Strauss II. And for me, it just yanks me out of the movie so strongly. It doesn't fit, and it just seems like, oh, we are the bad guys. We are the mustache twirling villains. So we must play this classical music song so you can tell that we are not bothered by the horrible, unethical things that we're doing, because we can listen to beautiful classical music that everybody associates with upper class. And that's how I interpreted it, and it just really doesn't work and takes me out of the movie. So it's a little nitpick, but it's kind of towards the end of the movie where Electro's characterization isn't really working. This scene pulls me out of it, and then when everything about the Green Goblin starts to come together, it sinks the movie pretty quickly. So this is just a small component of that. There's some editing in this movie that is really fast and frenetic and kind of just doesn't work in the context where I can almost not really track what's happening. And I know that sometimes editing benefits from having longer takes and longer shots, and sometimes faster takes and faster shots. But there are a few points in this movie where my brain barely had a second to register what I was seeing before it switched to something else, and then it switched again to something else in really rapid succession. And it just happens so often that I lost the sense of cohesion for this movie because I was kind of getting yanked back and forth. So some of the editing choices didn't work for me. And then the biggest negative is there's an entire subplot where the character Harry Osborn is introduced. He's played by Dane DeHaan, who I think is a pretty strong actor. I've only seen him in a few other things, but I do really like him. And I was excited when he was announced as being cast for Harry Osborn because I thought there's a pretty good actor. Maybe there's a good chance this could work out. But I think the way he's introduced, how he's some old, long-lost childhood friend of Peter's, but then they don't really have much to substantiate that, and then they hang out and kind of catch up. And then how I do like that Norman Osborn, played by Chris Cooper, is introduced as having like a genetic condition that makes him goblin-y, and that Harry has inherited that, so he's going to become subject to this degenerative disease, and he kind of has this existential dread in front of him as a young man. I think that's interesting. But then it kind of gets to the point where he needs Spider-Man's blood, and that kind of gets weird, and then Peter and Spider-Man know each other, and then he kind of figures it all out, and then he decides to inject himself with this serum that's untested, and then it accelerates his goblin-like growth, and his ears get pointy for some reason, and his teeth get sharp for some reason, as if that's some kind of real human degenerative disease. So it's just really weird. And then he goes into Oscorp, and then there is a goblin glider and a green suit that perfectly fit him, and that he can fly perfectly without any prior practice. I don't know any vehicle on Earth that is piloted quite like that goblin glider, and yet he just steps on it and knows how to do it and fly throughout the city. He's going up really high too, and he seems totally fine with that. And then he's got these bombs. It just seems so rushed and so fast and so unearned that pretty much the whole movie falls apart because of it. Electro, even though I don't think he's the best characterized villain, he's the villain from the beginning and then throughout the middle, and he kind of has his own thing he's trying to do, and it's an opposition to our heroes. And so, but it makes sense. And then all of a sudden at the end, this side character becomes a villain who's opposed to Spider-Man and Peter, and it just kind of gets crazy. I do like that they adapt the demise of Gwen Stacy from the comics at the hands of Green Goblin, but it also feels unearned because they don't have a history, or much of a history. They do meet earlier in the movie as their alter egos, but I just think that whole subplot fails, and as a result, it just drags down the whole movie as kind of the culminating feature that doesn't work in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. Now, let's take a moment for the Spider-Man suit in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I think this is the best Spider-Man suit ever committed to film. I think it's perfect from top to bottom. I think the size and the whiteness of the eyes is outstanding. I think the silhouette of the suit is perfect. And then they do bring in the lines and they clean it up compared to the dumpster fire that was the suit in The Amazing Spider-Man. He's got crisp red and blue lines. The raised webbing kind of carries over from the original Spider-Man trilogy, but it's not as pronounced. It's more subtle, and I think that's terrific. The feet look good. Andrew Garfield is long and lanky, which is what I want in a Spider-Man. I don't want to see muscular and thick. I want to see long and lanky like a spider's legs. And I think he just nails it. And I think the colors are a little darker than I might have picked, but still the red and blue stand out really well. He's got the really long Spider-Man symbol on the front and on the back, which isn't really true to the comics, but I think it works in this version just based on the shape of Andrew Garfield's torso, and then just kind of the lines of the suit make it seem like he would want a longer and skinnier spider suit. So I'll go down on record, even with things that we've seen since this movie came out, I still think this is by far and without question the best Spider-Man suit we've ever seen. Now, how might The Amazing Spider-Man 2 connect to Spider-Man Brand New Day? None of the actors in this movie are part of the cast list for Spider-Man Brand New Day, so I don't expect to see anybody with a significant role. There's always a chance for cameos, but I don't really see how that would work. Andrew Garfield and Jamie Foxx do come into the MCU later on in Spider-Man No Way Home, and in that version, Electro gets a power upgrade and his electricity becomes yellow as an homage to the comics in that silly yellow and green costume. But then they go back to their universes. I don't expect to see those characters come back in Avengers Doomsday, but there are some people who think that we will see Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield in Avengers Secret Wars in 2027. I don't think that'll be true, but we also haven't seen Doomsday yet. So once we see Doomsday, we might have a better sense of what Secret Wars may be. Regardless, I don't think they'll be in either of those movies or in Spider-Man Brand New Day. Now, how might The Amazing Spider-Man 2 connect to Avengers Doomsday? None of the actors in this movie are part of the cast list for Avengers Doomsday, so I don't think we're going to see any of them with significant roles or cameos. We did see Andrew Garfield and Jamie Foxx come into the MCU in Spider-Man No Way Home, where they came back as Spider-Man and Electro even gets the yellow electricity in that movie, but then they went back to their universes. I don't expect that we're going to see them in Avengers Doomsday, and there are some people who think we'll see Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield back as the Spider-Man characters in Avengers Secret Wars. I think that's a stretch, and since we haven't seen Doomsday yet, I don't think we know what Secret Wars is going to be about. So that remains to be seen, but I don't think we're going to have any connection between this movie and Avengers Doomsday or Secret Wars. So that's my review of The Amazing Spider-Man 2. What do you think of this movie, and how do you think it might connect to Spider-Man Brand New Day or Avengers Doomsday? Make sure to let me know in the comments below. Follow Movie Marathons HQ on Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube, and also on Letterboxd, where you can see all of the movie marathons that we are doing right now and that we have done in the past. The next movie in this marathon is Captain America: Civil War. See you at the movies.